Good evening, viewers. Good afternoon, because I know there are some colleagues in other countries because of the time differences. I am Twebaze Paul. I work at the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment. I serve as a research fellow, and ACCORD is based here in Uganda, although it operates in most of the regions of Africa. Yeah, thank you very much. I think uh, to bring out to the contextual understanding of climate change is try to help differentiate it from weather, because usually that's where we have a lot of challenges. There is a lot of information about climate change, so if you define it, then you don't solve the problem. But usually, we very many people quite often associate climate change with change in just weather. But the difference is that climate change happens when there is consistent variation of weather patterns for a very longer period of time, usually 10 years and above. And weather is basically the state of the atmosphere for a very short time. So the problems we usually face is you see people seeing a lot of sunshine in one day, and then they conclude and say that is climate change. No, that's not. That's weather. Others will say it is raining and it is not stopping in one day, and they say climate change. No, that's just weather. So climate change is basically about variation of weather patterns for a period of time. And for you to say that the climate has changed, you should have monitored this for a very long time. So when we talk about climate change, we mean that there has been variations of weather consistently for a longer period of time. And that's why we say long droughts. A short drought cannot imply climate change because that would be a pattern, short pattern of weather. But we say long droughts. You look at the long rainfalls that you have not been planned for. We are used to rains that take a day. Then now you have rains coming and they don't stop uh, forever. And usually we also describe climate change arising from its shocks and its ability to cause effect. But that's of course a long topic. You know, currently we have people doing PhDs in just climate change alone. But simply put, it's about that. And for Uganda, if you interested in what climate change means for Uganda, you need to understand that Uganda is an agro-based country. It is a country that is depending majorly on nature for its productivity. Nature is about God-given resources, and being an agro-based economy, it means its industrialization depends on agriculture. Its revenue base depends on agriculture. Its income depends on agriculture. Everything depends on the natural resources. And you see, climate change, those variations affect the way we have always interacted and depended on nature. So it means if you are planning to have harvests, then the harvest will not come as planned. You will lose revenue that you were envisaging. So you start having losses. If you are planning even to employ people, climate change can frustrate employment because you wanted to employ these people on the sector that you depend on. So for an agro-based economy, climate change actually can hit Uganda hard and stop it from even realizing its development agenda. So Uganda cannot as a developing country that is still depending on nature, cannot be able to achieve its development ambitions because of the frustration arising from the climatic changes. Basically, that is what it would mean for Uganda. The implication is basically that climate change can frustrate, first of all, development planning, realization of revenue, can curtail employment, but can also increase the debt burden because you cannot sustain yourself, you have to borrow. When you lose employment, you know what it means. When you lose revenue, you know what it means. And so, for a country that is already depending highly on foreign aid, if you get climate change also coming in, you end up with a very high debt burden because you need a lot of money to put in place climate resilient infrastructure, those that cannot be washed away by the climate shocks. You need to be planning, you need a lot of budget, by the way. You have had even disasters happening. You need to deal with those disasters, you need money, and yet you don't have it because the source of income is already crippled. So, Uganda, like any other developing country, uh, has a lot of burden arising from the climate change itself, because it has to make sure it has to look for resources. A good example is these usual currencies that you see. We can no longer, for example, you put a road, the road that was initially lasting for 10 years, the maram will be washed away the next week. You put culverts, they are washed away. So it means even the material you use, even the roads infrastructure you put in place, even everything you do must now be expensive because you have to plan something that is resilient or can withstand the climate change shocks. So for me, that's the implication. That's the actual meaning. Yes, climate justice basically um, comes from the traditional understanding of environmental justice. But of course, without going back to that, climate justice is about participation, is about fairness, is about uh, having an equal burden. Actually, we don't even say equal, but someone should be able to bear the burden according to his or her contribution. Now, starting from the global level, the countries that have polluted more or that have contributed much to the problem of climate change should be contributing much in developing solutions. That's why we talk about the developed countries which polluted more during their industrialized processes to be able to remit some money in form of delivering climate finance contribution to the developing countries to help solve the problem. And that's at an international level. Uh, so whoever has caused much problem should be able to contribute much to the solution. Now, when it comes to the local level, yes, or the domestic level, you need to understand that climate change affects people differently, and its effects, by the way, become harder depending on the level of development or the level of how much money you have in the pocket. Now, the injustice comes when you develop interventions that are supposed to solve climate change, but these interventions also affect the people who are already vulnerable more. I'll give you an example. When most countries actually look at natural resource conservation as a means to solving climate change, such as forestry protection for purposes of increasing the carbon sequestration and reducing emissions. But you see, we develop these interventions and say, please stop accessing the forest. You are telling the people who have previously depended on these forest resources for their livelihood. They are poor people, actually. So, in a bid to solve the problem, you are telling them to go away from the forest without, for example, any compensation. You have not involved them in the debate. They don't even know. That means they have not participated, and they just get it as a shock. So we are saying that that is not fairness, because your interventions are continuing to make them more vulnerable, more poorer than even before. So we are saying that it becomes an injustice. So climate justice is about that fairness, recognizing that these people whom we are putting at the center of driving solutions need, for example, affirmative action. They need to be treated well, they need to be involved because they are helping solving a problem where they have not contributed much. We have cases where the vulnerable people, the solutions we put in place to solve the problem, continue to make some sections of society more vulnerable and end up even enriching others. So you find that the rich, for example, get more richer by these interventions, while the poor people are even getting poorer. So there we say there is no climate justice. We say this is an injustice. And some of these examples have been seen, usually the forest dependent communities. We have seen some indigenous communities that we usually drive out of these forests in order to protect the forest for conservation without even giving them alternative to land. So we say that basically that's unfairness. So climate justice means that as you put in place interventions to solve the problem of climate change, have it at the back of your mind that you should be fair, you should be inclusive, there should be participation, and you need to do it in a way that does not compromise more or make some societies more vulnerable because you're already in that vulnerable position. Yes, of course, climate finance basically is about the basket of resources that we mobilize and put together to develop climate change interventions or climate change solutions. So the amount of money or amount of funding that you need to fund the solutions to the problems brought about by climate change is basically what we call climate finance. Okay. So climate finance does not necessarily have to be to come from very far. It can also be internally generated as long as you set aside some basket of resources to deal with that. So all that is called climate financing. Yeah. But at international level, we have, of course, under the Paris Agreement, we have the structures of climate financing, where countries commit some resources and say, this is the money that each country is going to contribute to solve the problem. And as a result, those who have been contributing a lot of money, of course, have been some of the countries that were originally, of course, contributed much to the pollution problem, the emission problem, so that they also help in addressing it. Although sometimes the commitments, the funds committed do not come as planned. But even the developing countries are supposed to also start looking at different streams of financing their climate initiatives. And for example, Uganda, of course, has also been putting in place a number of interventions to make sure we generate resources. And first, this stems from, as I said, at international level, you have to commit, like the rest of the countries, to be a party to some of these agreements. So Uganda signed the Paris Agreement. And because when you don't commit, then you are excluded from that global financial mechanism because you don't qualify, you are not a member. So when you remember, then you can start also competing for some of those resource baskets, for example, under the Global Environment Facility. Then, aside of that, it is also you have to put in place the enabling framework to allow you access that climate financing. It doesn't just come because you have to have the level of preparedness. Just like any other fundraising, you must have the capability, the capacity. So Uganda did some level of preparedness. First of all, putting in place the relevant uh, legal and policy framework. We developed the climate change policy. We developed the Climate Change Act in 2021. We also added the required regulations. We have actually adjusted and tried to follow these laws. We know that every government agency now is required to be climate change compliant. We amended our Public Finance Management Act of 2015 to make sure we introduce certificate of compliance so that every government institution pledges and shows how it is going to address, how it is going, it is trying to solve the problem or has embedded the, the, the initiatives to address climate shocks in the planning and budgeting, and all those initiatives are aimed at make sure we comply to be able to generate climate financing. So the putting in place of the climate finance, amending the Public Finance Management Act, we also introduced, by the way, initiatives at an institutional level. We strengthened our institutions. For example, arising from the same legal framework, we had to create the climate finance unit in the Ministry of Finance, and its role is majorly to mobilize resources, to write proposals, to provide guidance to private sector, civil society on how to leverage financing for climate initiatives. But you also know we have now another specific climate change department, the Ministry of Water and Environment, specifically to do that. But you also know the National Planning Authority um, has now a specific also unit to deal with climate change compliance. So some of these initiatives are all aimed at making sure we leverage climate financing. Then aside of that, we have effort now translating to the local government level, and from these laws, we continue to require the district local governments to implement also right away the provisions of these laws by integrating uh, climate change in their development plans and budgets. And the Ministry of Finance continues to make sure all this happens so that at the end of the day, we are able to generate resources that are able to sustain climate um, initiatives. The private sector is also being modeled in the same direction to begin investing in climate change initiatives. And of course, currently it is coming as a nature-based enterprise development. So basically, that's what I can say. But there is a lot that the government of Uganda is doing, and it's not only government of Uganda, it's every interested party has to walk through this. Even NGOs are doing the same. The vision, objectives, and mandate of Accord as a policy and research think tank has been to generate the required evidence to inform the policy making process. So Accord has done a lot of studies that have informed all those legal processes that I've basically been talking about. We participated in a number of policy development initiatives, right away from the climate change policy, right away from, of course, the Climate Change Act, the Public Finance Act, and all these processes. We've been able to review and even provide feedback so that we are able to have better policies that are informed by evidence. So we have done research and generated information, generated substantial evidence to inform uh, these policies and also strengthen the institutions. That's one major contribution. But we have not only stopped at policy work, we have actually changed from the initial boardroom work to what we call think to do. So much as we think tank, we no longer think just thinking. We think and now apply. So as a code, we have also worked with government agencies to pilot some of these initiatives. For example, we've worked to build the capacity of government mandated agencies to track climate financing. We have, for example, engaged worked with NPA to build the capacity of different agencies in terms of how they need to design the programs and how they need to generate resources. We have run trainings for government agencies, but we have also built the capacity of the district local governments in how to develop some of these key initiatives and how to integrate climate change in their programming and budgeting. And as a result, the districts are now integrating climate change initiatives in their development plans. We've basically also tried to do work that contributes to climate change mitigation, reduces emissions by promoting conservation, you know, apart from, of course, doing advocacy and doing work related to research in natural resource conservation to generate data. We have empowered some of these communities to protect and conserve. We have supported the collaborative forest management institutions. We have also worked with agencies like NFA, UWA to support conservation work in a number of areas, to the extent that in some instances we have even been to court to make sure some of these conservation areas or protected areas are not just degazetted because they work as carbon sinks. So we've basically done quite a lot of work in that area, and we do.
Any current
we,
projects
we
that
even
are running?
partner with the climate with the National Planning Authority to continue doing this work, streamlining. We do climate change compliance reports or studies every year. I think we now have published like the fourth. We assess the development plan to see that it is basically climate change compliant by different agencies of government, and this information, by the way, is available on our website. But we have also been partnering with institutions, with donors. Currently, we are running a project funded by the Royal Danish Embassy and other embassies to promote climate justice and service delivery. We are doing this work in West Nile and Karamoja because these regions have most been vulnerable, and the project is in form of an affirmative action to try to promote inclusion, voice in planning and development, so that the people who have previously been depending on the natural resources for their livelihood are able to have their voice included or heard in decision-making processes. So we have currently even a team in Arua to deal with the West Nile region, and a team in Karamoja to do groundwork in the region to support communities, including the indigenous communities such as the Ik, the Tepeth, who have these are marginalized communities who previously lived in these forests and were evicted to be part of this discussion, because we believe that climate justice is about involving everyone in policy making, but also in implementation. So basically, those are some of the initiatives we are doing. We do dialoguing. We even, by the way, collect views and work to present them in international conferences, in the COP, Conference of Parties, to guide decision making at that level. So it's quite a lot that we do here at ACORD. I think my final say is that climate change is a responsibility of everyone, whether you are rich or poor, because the shocks have no boundaries. Because recently we saw flooding, for example, at Dubai International Airport, and you're like, but even these countries that we seem are better off are also suffering from similar shocks. The other thing is that the effects of climate change have no boundaries. They have no geographical boundaries. It is true. You can have uh, you can have more challenges in one area, but still, even in a different area where the problem uh, did not happen, we will also finally have a test on the share. So it is a responsibility of everyone, not only the rich and not only the poor. Everyone has a role to play. And the solutions to climate change shocks can also begin small by small. Every individual, for example, every Ugandan citizen, can start practicing interventions that can, at the end of the day, solve the problem. For example, you planted one tree, the numbers of trees will have grown by one. The sequestration capacity will have grown. If you do interventions to reduce deforestation, you have made a contribution. If you do sustainable utilization of water resources, you have also helped. If you manage the way you deal with your waste, your waste disposal, you have made a contribution. So we should not wait for interventions to come from very far. We need to start small by small, and then together we will reach.
And then for the policymakers?
The policymakers, of course, their role has always been one, to make policies that are people-centered, pro-people policies, policies that do not marginalize some of the sections of society, policies that involve everyone and where everyone's voice is included. Because we have seen some policies or some directives that happen without consultation of the people and end up creating an imbalance. I'll give an example. We have a presidential directive that bans charcoal production, commercial charcoal production in Western Nile and Karamoja. The president had a very good ambition and vision because in his thinking, he knew that this would solve a problem by increasing the protection of the forest cover and reducing deforestation.
Yeah.
But when you look at the way it is being, for example, implemented or enforced, you realize that there is some discrimination in enforcement. So at the end of the day, it does not achieve its intended objectives. In those communities, for example, have no alternative sources of energy. They have been depending on charcoal for their livelihood. For me, a good policy should have taken into consideration those vulnerable aspects of those societies so that as you plan to ban, you have also created some alternatives. But what is happening is now is that the enforcers are basically benefiting quite more from the ban, yet the ban continues to make the vulnerable people more vulnerable. The women, of course, are forced to run away from their charcoal-based businesses of food. The youth run away from chapati business, and now at the end of the day, because they have to abandon these businesses since charcoal has become expensive. But when they go home and realize that now the enforcers are also benefiting from the same charcoal, these people pass behind and now start directly trading or encroaching on the forest now to trade in the charcoal. So it means you have forced them now from uh, business of food, business of chapatis, now to go directly to the forest to start cutting charcoal, which is even more criminal. So some of these, the voices of some of these people, if they had been included in the whole setup, it would minimize the risk. So at the end of the day, what comes out is, whereas you thought you would reduce the forest cover loss by instituting such a directive, we will come up with studies that show something different. You'll find that the forest cover will have dwindled more than the previous time. So I think such policies are required to be thought of, before even they are implemented.